Episode 7 of The Acolyte is here and we need to break it down, so let's get straight into it. We open the episode with another flashback and we get to see a younger soul examine the foliage on Brendok. In the background we can see Torbin doing the same, while Indara uses some sort of ground scanning device, and Kalnacca just looks around a little aimlessly. As night falls, we learn that Torbin is tired of eating Nuna legs, which are birds typically native to the swamps of Naboo, but have since spread all over the galaxy. The young padawan is just tired of being on the planet and really just wants to return to Coruscant. We then learn why the Jedi are on the planet in the first place, and we learn from Indara that Brendok was catalogued as lifeless 100 years ago following a hyperspace disaster, which references the first event that kicked off the High Republic era known as the Great Hyperspace Disaster. The disaster occurred when the Starship Legacy run was sabotaged and disintegrated during hyperspace travel, which resulted in debris scattering across multiple systems. Given the speed in which the debris was traveling, any planet or objects it came into contact would yield major destruction, potentially wiping out life on certain planets depending on the size of the debris. We hear a younger soul explain that they are actually looking for a vergence, which is an area and significant concentration or focal point in the Force, where its energies are unusually strong, potentially being strong enough to affect the physical and metaphysical realms. Some of the vergences that we know of include the Dark Side Cave on Dagobah, as well as Anakin Skywalker himself, a walking manifestation of a vergence.
I've encountered a vergence in the Force.
And I have to say, the moment Soul speaks, you can tell it isn't quite the Soul that we're familiar with in the present day. This is a much more impatient and reckless younger version of himself. And this impatience is highlighted even more in the next scene when Indara mentions that they aren't even sure if a vergence is the cause of life returning to Brendok, and also notes that Soul was unbalanced. She goes on to tell him that she is trying to teach Torbin to find the answers for himself instead of simply telling him, something which Soul silently disagrees with. And it's an interesting conversation because it's a very important lesson in mentorship, which is quite comparable to give a man a fish and you feed him for a day, teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. And so Soul's impatience to simply tell Torbin the answer is a reflection of this youthful short-term thinking, while Indara is able to keep the bigger picture in mind. Indara jests a little by saying that is why she has a padawan and he does not, which as we learn later is something that Soul is yearning for, a pupil of his own. During Soul's exploration of the Force, he stumbles upon Osha's and May's interaction, providing us a different perspective of what we saw before. Soul is immediately intrigued by the Force-sensitive nature of the twins and follows them all the way back to their settlement. We then get another alternate perspective on the twins' training, as well as answers as to why Anastasia and Coral seemingly sense something during this scene. We also get to see a brief scene of the witches communing with the Whole that we saw in a different scene from a different episode, and so I do wonder what could be down there, potentially the source of the vergence that the Jedi are looking for. Back at the camp, the Jedi speculate whether it could be the Night Sisters, which is another Force-sensitive cult they would be familiar with, but we are then told that the Night Sisters do not train or raise younglings, which is quite interesting. From what we know, the Night Sisters do increase their numbers by breeding with men or recruiting other Force-sensitive outsiders, which is why we see Morgan Elsbeth, a human, as a Night Sister, and Ventress, a native to Dathomir, also as a Night Sister as well. So perhaps the Night Sisters simply do not take in underage Force sensitives and do not train their own until they're fully grown adults. Indara suggests that they defer to the council, but Soul's concern and impatience leads them to make a different decision. Indara also tries to go in alone, but Soul and Torbin protest, and you could almost argue that their disagreement does stem from a fear of the unknown. The truth of the matter is, they simply do not understand what the witches are about or what they will do to the girls, and much of this fear of the unknown is driving their decision making, which as we all know is the perfect recipe for disaster. And what is also interesting about this episode is that when we see the Jedi walk into the Coven, we see it from their perspective, which is that they're immediately surrounded by armed witches, making the Coven more of a threat, whereas back in episode 3, when we see the Jedi walk in from the witches' perspective, it seems more like they were the alien threat. So quite the interesting juxtaposition here. We also get to see Torbin being manipulated, and we learn that he is from the planet Bonadan, which is located in the corporate sector, also known for its mines, which is perhaps why Torbin was able to identify that the witches are living in an abandoned mining facility so quickly. Anastasia tempts Torbin by promising that she can give him what he wants, and the moment he admits that he wants to return to Coruscant, it effectively gives her an in to his mind. The whole situation ends up being diffused by Osha, and the Jedi return to their ship with a promise that the girls will be tested. Sol admits to Indara that he feels a connection to Osha, and Indara cautions him about this feeling. And you also can't help but wonder if Sol's supposed connection to Osha is really confirmation bias from him simply wanting to have a padawan and with her simply being willing. Then it is a genuine connection through the Force. Indara cautions him on the feasibility of such a thing, especially with her being too old and the Coven not willing to let the girls go, which is actually a really important line of thinking because it actually shows that the Jedi aren't bad guys who forcibly take kids away from their parents, that there is an acknowledgement that both sides must be mutually consenting. Sol goes on to describe the witch's power as dark magic, which induced the marking on May's forehead, and the fact that he immediately jumps to the conclusion or labels the witch's power as the dark side does also show that his thoughts are clouded by what he doesn't understand, a sort of judging a book by its cover, if you will. Indara pushes back against this by saying that that's not necessarily the case, as there are many cultures who use markings. Essentially, from the Jedi perspective, there just isn't enough information to make an informed decision, and the danger of making decisions without understanding everything is that you end up only seeing what you want.
Do not confuse what Osha wants with what you want.
We also get to see May's test, and May explains that after Ascension, both Osha and her will be leaders of their coven, which something she doesn't even understand herself. She also goes on to say that everyone must walk through fear and be sacrificed to fulfill their destiny. And Sol's reaction immediately tells you that he was only listening to the second part of the sentence and not the first, which is arguably more in line with the Jedi thinking. We also get to see Sol's interaction with Osha, and you can see Indara's discomfort with what Sol is doing. We learned that Indara wasn't quite happy with Sol's coaching of Osha to get her to pass the test, and it is quite understandable considering that Osha herself was relatively undecided if she wanted to leave her coven or not. And while Sol's intentions were good, his coaching of Osha effectively obscures the line between her decision and his decision. Night falls and we learn that the Council has decided not to take in Osha as a Jedi, much to Sol's disappointment. Indara argues that it is Sol's emotional attachment that is influencing his decision, and his angry response kinda tells you everything you need to know. Torbin reports that Osha and May's M count is extremely high, but weirdly their symbionts are exactly the same, which is impossible as they are twins. Now, this is the first time we've heard the word symbionts used within the context of the midichlorians, so not really much is known about it, but potentially it could allude to perhaps DNA or some sort of equivalent to it. This leads to the Jedi concluding that they must be a product of the Virgins, as that can only be the explanation for all of this, with the Virgins taking one mind and splitting it into two, which is a major red flag as they come to this hasty conclusion. Because for Sol, this vindicates his want to train Osha, and for Torbin, he sees this as a way to go back to Coruscant, so neither of them are thinking quite clearly. And this also leads to the big lore question, which is, if the twins are a manifestation born from the Virgins, does it diminish the importance of Anakin's birth? Well, for one, the theory that the twins were created from these virgins has yet to be confirmed and is speculation at this point. But if we were to assume that this is indeed true, that the twins were created through a virgins, it doesn't necessarily diminish Anakin's birth, as canonically, his birth was purely conceived by the Force. Unlike May and Osha, who were conceived artificially, Anakin was purely natural. And so in a way, having Anakin be born purely from the Force actually makes his birth far more important, knowing that the artificial conception is possible. Torbin decides to take matters into his own hands, and Sol chases after him on speeders, which is quite reminiscent of the Return of the Jedi. We also get to see what happens to May when Coral takes her away after her outburst, and we see Coral coaching May to get mad, which does make her very, very suspicious. Anastasia makes the difficult decision to be a mother instead of a leader, and Sol senses that the girls are in trouble, which convinces him to join Torbin in rescuing the girls. We see the witches arm themselves, and we get a little suspicious moment when Coral orders the witches to all gather in the common room, basically putting all the witches into one location. We also get to see May starting the fire, which turns out to be more of an accident instead of an intentional decision, likely spurred on by her anger. Torbin and Sol challenge the witches over the creation of the twins, and when May comes out crying for help, Sol actually mistakes her for Osha, once again showing that he isn't really guided by the Force but by his emotions, as he was unable to sense which twin it was. Coral tries to attack Torbin, and Mother Anastasia finally demonstrates her power, turning this into a black whisper of smoke. And you can see the moment where Sol seemingly thinks that this power is being directed towards May, which leads him to stab Mother Anastasia. But when you slow the footage down, you can actually see that the smoke was actually reaching for Torbin and Coral, likely trying to prevent a conflict between them. And this dialogue-less moment of visual storytelling tells you everything you need to know about the different character motivations and why Sol made such a disastrous mistake, a mistake that could haunt him to the present day. Mother Anastasia tells Sol what her final decision was, and Sol realizes his mistake. And May seeing the Jedi kill her mother is most certainly a traumatizing event, and finally makes sense as to why she thinks the Jedi are responsible. Sol lets himself get beat up a little, and an explosion occurs, which interestingly enough isn't caused by either party, leading me to conclude that it must be the Sith who are truly behind the explosion. Coral and the witches use their power to take control of Kalnacca, and considering that it took the entire coven to control one Wookiee, it says a lot. The subsequent fight between the Jedi was also pretty interesting because you can see the pure brute strength of the Wookiee in every swing he makes. We finally see how Torbin loses an eye and gets his scars, and they only manage to subdue the Wookiee when Indara intervenes. Master Indara manages to sever the witch's connection to Kalnacca, and this seemingly ends up killing all of them. And I do wonder if this was a direct result of using the Force or the abrupt severing of the connection. Considering that the witches talk about sacrifice a lot, I wouldn't be surprised if this was indeed the cost of using such a power. It also goes to show just how powerful Mother Anastasia was, being able to control Torbin all by herself. Sol runs off to find May and Osha and is then forced to make the heartbreaking decision to choose who to save, ultimately deciding to choose Osha. And I think his decision to save Osha adds another layer of complexity, as you could question whether his choice to save Osha was driven by the Force or by his emotions. Considering he mistook May for Osha, you could almost argue that the real connection he feels is actually with May and not Osha. Instead, his understanding of this connection became obscured by his emotions, leading to a misinterpretation that it was Osha that he was connected to. Master Indara ends up making a decision that the team will not tell the council what actually happened, and cover it all up, believing that it is in the best interest of Osha, who has lost everything. We get a moment of tension between Indara and Sol, and ultimately the decision to not tell the council what really happened is simply because Sol is now the only thing Osha has, and so if he faces the council and is exiled from the order, things won't be so great for her. But really, it's an imperfect decision, and arguably one that is also emotionally driven, much like Sol and Torbin's decision to interfere. And the biggest takeaway from this episode really isn't about who is the good guy or the bad guy, but rather a number of characters making imperfect decisions based on their emotions instead of looking at it objectively. I have to say, this was one of the best episodes of the show, and I thoroughly enjoyed it because of how focused it was on the characters and why they made the decisions they made. That being said, there are still a lot of unanswered questions about that night. Anyways, that's all for this breakdown. Be sure to let me know what you think in the comments down below. Be sure to like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. I'm the Lost Acolyte,
and I have spoken.